Yeah, thank you all for joining this Stockholm Security Conference session, which is titled Strategic Stability at Sea, Nuclear-Armed Submarines, Anti-Submarine Warfare, and Underwater Drones. My name is Tytti Erästä, and I'm a senior researcher at SIPRI's Weapons of Mass Destruction program, where I'm working on nuclear arms control related issues. I'll be moderating this panel and would like to start by reminding you that the discussion will be recorded or is being recorded and made available online later. In this webinar format, we'll only be able to see the panelists, but the audience is warmly welcome to participate by posting their questions using the Q&A function. I'll do my best to take note of all the questions and convey them to the panelists. So this panel will examine some recent developments related to naval nuclear systems from the point of view of strategic stability. Particular focus is on SSBNs, which stands for both nuclear-armed and powered ballistic missile submarines. Many nuclear-armed states view such ballistic missile submarines as their most important nuclear delivery means. This is because they can hide in vast oceans or seas and are therefore very hard to detect and track. By providing a survivable second strike capability against counter-force strikes, the deployment of nuclear weapons undersea is thought to contribute to strategic stability. And although our focus in the session is on strategic stability, it's perhaps worth emphasizing that stable doesn't necessarily equal to safe when it comes to the nuclear order. Indeed, as we have been reminded during Russia's war on Ukraine, there is no guarantee that nuclear weapons will not be used, either intentionally or by accident. But strategic stability is thought to reduce the likelihood of such use by lessening the incentives to strike first, at least based on the traditional definition of crisis stability. Strategic stability is also understood as arms race stability, which means less incentives to build up more of these dangerous weapons. Several countries have for a long time relied on naval nuclear weapons to maintain credible deterrence. While ballistic missile submarines are a key component of Russian and US nuclear triads and the French dyad, the UK solely relies on a monad of sea-based weapons. Recently, China too has developed advanced ballistic missile submarines, and India is also developing theirs. At the same time, several countries are building up capabilities to more effectively detect and counter submarines. At least in theory, such detection and anti-submarine warfare capabilities could make ballistic missile submarines less survivable against counter-force strikes. So we'll soon be diving deeper into this and other issues, but first I'd like to briefly introduce our distinguished panelists. So in alphabetical order, first we have Dr. Norman Friedman, a renowned naval historian and strategist. He's the author of numerous seminal books, including histories of British and US warship design, handbooks of naval weapons, as well as accounts of the Cold War and naval strategy. In the past, Dr. Friedman has also worked at the Office of the Secretary of the US Navy and at the headquarters of US Marine Corps. And our second speaker is Hans Christensen from the Federation of American Scientists. He's one of the top experts in tracking and analyzing global nuclear forces. Among other things, Christensen co-authors the Nuclear Notebook column of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists and the World Nuclear Forces chapter of the SIPRI Yearbook, which are both key sources of publicly available information on nuclear weapons. One of his many previous posts was a special advisor to the Danish Minister of Defense. And Hans kindly agreed to step in as his colleague Matt Korda was unfortunately not able to make it today. And third, we have Sylvia Mishra, who is a senior nuclear policy associate at the Institute of Security and Technology and a policy advisor at the European Leadership Network. Her research focuses on nuclear strategy and non-proliferation, South Asian security, emerging and disruptive technologies, and military innovation. Sylvia is a non-resident fellow at the Stimson Center's South Asia program and involved in several initiatives promoting diversity in security discourse. Last but definitely not least is Wu Jiqiang, and please forgive me if I pronounced your name wrong. He's a professor at the School of International Studies, Renmin University of China, and Professor Wu is an expert on arms control issues with a focus on missile defense, nuclear strategy, and China-US strategic stability. Prior to his outstanding academic career, Professor Wu worked as a missile engineer at the China Aerospace Science and Industry Corporation. So it's truly an honor to have you all here. So I have asked all the panelists to provide some initial remarks in response to questions that I sent them in advance. And each of them will have up to 7 minutes for their remarks. And we'll need to be rather strict in following this time limit to allow enough time for discussion, as we'll need to end by 2:15 p.m. So next, I'd like to open the discussion by inviting Dr. Friedman to address a question to which I already alluded earlier, namely, to what extent do you think sea-based nuclear deterrence is undermined by the development of anti-submarine warfare capabilities? And how would you assess the impact on strategic stability? So please, Dr. Friedman, the floor is yours now.
Well, first, before I talk about what exists, it's important to think seriously about what strategic stability comes from. It comes from a sense on the part of governments that it's too dangerous to try to start a nuclear war, that they have no assurance whatever that whatever they do will work. That means that even if there's a very good chance of destroying, say, all of the ballistic missile submarines in the world, most governments would not find that a very attractive proposition. They will hunt nuclear subs, there's no question, but to do what's usually described as a decisive attack, you have to do quite a bit. You have to get them all more or less at once. Otherwise, the victim may decide that you're hunting and decide to do something about it. There's something that goes deeper here, and we're watching a very frightening example of it not working. Normally, governments are very aware that if they invite nuclear attack, they will personally be destroyed. That tends to be extremely sobering. And it's really what's kept major countries from using nuclear weapons. It isn't that they would be abhorred or everyone would decide they were disgusting, it's that they would personally get killed. And so they're all locked in a situation of stability unless they have some very, very reliable means of beating off an attack. And early on in my career as a strategist, when I was working for Herman Kahn, who knew a good deal about this, he commented that even if it appeared that we were open to attack, that no one in his right mind would take a chance on it. Now, unfortunately, the words "in his right mind" come up. And the reason that the Ukraine war is so terrifying is that obviously deterrence has failed. It doesn't matter whether Mr. Putin escalates to the point of showing off that he has nuclear weapons. The fact that he even talks about it is very frightening. The other thing that's bad about it is that if you watch as a small country, your immediate reaction is, if I had nuclear weapons, none of this would ever happen. That's exactly what's happened in North Korea. And if I were Ukrainian, it would have to occur to me that surrendering Soviet-era nuclear weapons probably wasn't the world's best idea. The more nuclear weapons states there are, the worse things are, the better the chance that something very bad happens. And the fact that Mr. Putin felt that he could invade a fellow country with no kickback whatever, and that he's shown enormous surprise that there has been a kickback, if you're interested in stability, this is a very frightening thing. There's no way out of that. As far as the stability of underwater weapons, the fact that the United States and Britain are investing very heavily in a new generation of strategic submarines says that both of them believe that no realistic means of eliminating their deterrent exists. Obviously, the nature of non-acoustics and things like that isn't public. I can tell you that I don't think it's ever worked terribly well, and the oceans aren't going to become transparent in the near future. But the best evidence is the investment. Now, if you build nuclear subs that are noisy and are easily detected, no, you're not in very good shape. But because no one wants to take that chance, you probably are fine. It's a matter of how governments think about their chances. And we work for governments that are reasonably rational and don't think that taking chances is a terribly good idea. If you have a national leader who boasts about not thinking about the downside of things, it's a very different situation and extremely frightening. And it's probably going to lead to nuclear proliferation on a large scale. If I'm a small country who feels threatened, I may very well see nuclear weapons as a guarantee of my existence. Forget about independence. And that's the biggest issue there is. If you want something that you would not like to have happen, you're watching it right now. As far as new technology goes, I did that paper for the Australians some time ago, and none of the new technology that was being pushed was terribly impressive. Furthermore, it did not seem possible for anyone to identify strategic submarines as opposed to others, which meant there were a lot more targets that had to be dealt with by anyone planning to make a strategic first strike. If you can't identify the target you're after, the odds are you'll hit something else and give away the game. These things only work if they're sudden and by surprise. That isn't in the cards, or at least it doesn't seem to be. Now, can I guarantee that tomorrow morning someone won't invent some way of making the ocean transparent? Of course I can. As far as the possibilities that have been laid out, yes, you could have unmanned vehicles that can fill the ocean and detect everything, but no one can afford anything on that scale. It's a very big ocean. And many of the current missiles have extremely long ranges, which means there's a lot of sea room for them to hide in, while they can still carry out what they must. But fundamentally, if you were a rational head of government, are you going to chance the end of your country, certainly the end of your capital city, based on your guess that your equipment works? You'd have to be insane. Unfortunately, there are such people. And you're watching it right now. But and then finally, there's the other underwater drone that was mentioned, which is a Russian Poseidon weapon. And that's particularly insane because it's a very long range, high speed missile, underwater missile. If you move through the ocean at very high speed, the odds are you can be hurt. That means that in Mr. Putin's mind, we watch in horror as this thing approaches the United States to kill everybody on the East Coast. Well, first of all, the longer you have knowing that this thing is coming, the more incentive you have to make sure that you take everybody else with you. And Mr. Putin does not have any better missile defense than anyone else. He has somehow convinced a lot of his population that nuclear war is winnable and even fun. Good luck to that. So, first of all, it's so loud, I suspect you can destroy it with nuclear death bomb. And why someone should not try that, I don't know. Perhaps I don't understand the depth of modern Russian technology. But if it gives us that much warning, all it does is invite a more unpleasant response, which is exactly what you want to eliminate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Friedman. Yeah, lots of food for thought there. And yeah, we'll talk more about the Poseidon system also afterwards. But now I'd like to give the floor to Sylvia. And her work on emerging technologies has, among other things, focused on underwater drones, which Dr. Friedman also referred to in his presentation. So I wonder, what is your view on the strategic impact of modern anti-submarine warfare capabilities, and in particular underwater drones? So please go ahead, Sylvia, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Tuti. So the continued and the rapid evolution of technology is really abetting significant changes in the underwater undersea warfare. We are seeing with the emergence of sensors, processors, immense computing power, communication technologies are really at the verge of significant breakthroughs that can revolutionize the way we think about undersea platforms, the way undersea platforms so far have been deployed and developed. Just to highlight some of the trends that are buttressing some of these technological developments and advancements, now undersea and underwater drones are able to collect and gather data during peacetime and war. Modern sensors are able to gather data from the entire electromagnetic spectrum. And there's this idea of consistent surveillance and persistent surveillance and data collection of ocean floor, etc. All are contributing to significant developments in what we call as unmanned underwater technologies, unmanned underwater vehicles or drones. The important takeaway is that these developments have been happening over almost the past several decades, and individually they might not be significant developments, but cumulatively they really act as act in a holistic manner, which essentially provides a great deal of advantage for both offensive and defensive missions for UUVs. So it seems that increasingly UUVs do have an asymmetric advantage when deployed by countries and adversaries. It is also seeming that over the coming years, more and more countries are developing UUVs technologies. Countries have come up with UUV master plans and essentially ways on how to best leverage and really take advantage of the unmanned underwater vehicles or drones. What is important to also for us to note when it comes to the UUV technology is that the lack of a global code of conduct when it comes to the deployment of UUV technologies, and that really increases a lot of uncertainties and also injects a lot of ambiguity in terms of how countries develop some of these technologies. It is important to temper a little bit of the exuberant expectations from unmanned underwater drones, but also really situate them in some of the practical technological challenges that we are seeing. For example, the battery life has not improved, and underwater drones still take a lesser time to remain submerged. And we are also seeing the difficult challenges of communicating underwater. So several of these technical challenges really impede what some of the expectations of underwater drones could be. However, saying that, it is important to note that increasing advantage and advances in several of these technologies are rapidly increasing the role of offensive missions of UUVs. It is also important to note what are some of the impact on arms racing and arms race stability when it comes to deployment and development of underwater drones. it seems that countries would be able to leverage and hold at risk missions when underwater drones are deployed at maritime choke points. And the fact that there is no global code of conduct when it comes to UUVs, it's something that countries needs to pursue and really figure in the coming future, because as you mentioned at the start, it can raise the chances of inadvertent escalation and also miscalculations that could lie ahead. In the context and situation, if subs and like nuclear submarines really lose their advantage, we know that the idea of concealment has been at the foundation, at the heart of nuclear deterrence. And over time, if submarines erode their credibility in terms of being a secure second strike force, it's important for military planners to also think and ideate about how strategic stability, and especially strategic stability under sea, should be sustained and maintained over the future. One thing that is important to note when it comes to undersea stability is the lack of attribution. The attribution challenge when it comes to not really knowing, or not knowing which is an adversary sub, especially in the context of multiple actors. During the Cold War, essentially there was two superpowers, but now with the emergence of multiple actors in the horizon, the chances of attribution or knowing exactly within compressed timelines becomes a challenge. And therefore this adds to a whole set of challenges when it comes to understanding and rethinking attribution in undersea warfare. Some of the policy recommendations that I have for countries developing and expanding their UUVs inventory is to first develop a global code of conduct when it comes to UUVs. Second, it is also important to note how some of the UUVs are able to not only contribute to some of the wartime or military missions, but also able to really provide a leverage to submarines when it comes to becoming an important military asset when it comes to peacetime issues. For example, not just only intelligence gathering and reconnaissance, but also really able to understand the adversary submarine and collect data and communicate back to one's own communication system. Talking a little bit about some of the policy recommendation, I think it is important for us to recognize the challenge that unmanned underwater drones can be susceptible to cyber attacks, and that can really degrade the overall communication network and communication architecture, which essentially would inject, again, a lot of challenges to the question of strategic stability. Therefore, it is important for countries to also ideate on the ways that some of these underwater technologies that are being utilized and deployed also can be safe and secure from an adversary attack. I'll stop here and I look forward to the questions.
Thanks a lot, Sylvia. Yeah, I'm not muted. Yeah, it was interesting to compare a bit your views and Dr. Friedman's views on the drone issue. So maybe if you want to comment on each other's presentations later, that would be interesting. But now I would like to turn to Professor Wu for his assessment of these dynamics. And in particular, bearing in mind China's recent investments in naval nuclear weapons, I'd like to invite him to zoom in on China's role in all this. For example, Professor Wu, how do you see the survivability of China's sea-based deterrent and its threat perceptions related to the anti-submarine warfare capabilities of the United States and its regional allies. So please, Professor Wu, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. A simple answer to the question is I believe China does not have survivable ballistic missile submarines. We have built some submarines, but I believe they are not survivable. I explain further. China has developed 2 generations of SSBNs. The first generation in China, we call it type 092, has already retired and had never conducted deterrence patrol. Currently, we have the second generation, we call it type 094. In Western countries, you call it Jing class. Currently, PLA has 6 Jing class SSBNs, and according to US Pentagon reports, 4 of which are original versions, and the other 2 are modified versions. So according to a US Naval Intelligence report in, I believe in 2009, and the Jing class is submarines are noisy, and therefore relatively easy to detect. And I think probably the modified version of the Jing class is quieter than the original version, but I believe the improvement should be very limited. So as Dr. Friedman just said, noisy submarine is not a good submarine, but I'm very happy to see to hear that he said since no one wants to take chance for a completely successful first strike, so probably you are fine. I totally agree with that. I think this is a highly reassuring. So and also some people argue that China could use the South China Sea as a bastion and deploying conventional naval forces to protect its SSBNs. I strongly disagree with this idea. I think it's a bad idea. First, South China Sea is not defensible. So South China Sea is not China's territorial water. China has never claimed that the South China Sea is our territorial water. Never. So, and many countries run submarines in South China Sea. So it would be very difficult for Chinese Navy to protect its SSBNs in South China Sea. It's not doable, I think. Second, even if we could do it, I think the bastion strategy is not a good way to operate your sea-based nuclear deterrence. Basically, you have to use your best attack submarines and best surface warships to protect your ballistic missile submarines. From my perspective, it's a waste of your resources. You could use those resources for other important purposes. So, and another reason that the bastion strategy is not a good idea is that the range of China's submarine-launched ballistic missiles is very limited. So currently we have JL2, the SLBM. The range of JL2 is limited. So if launched from South China Sea, the JL2 cannot target continental United States. So if we want to use if in order to target United States, so Chinese submarine would have to pass through the first island chain and get into the Pacific Ocean. So, you know, it's given US ASW anti-submarine warfare capability deployed along the first island chain, that kind of pass would be very dangerous. So the whole idea of turning South China Sea into a bastion it doesn't make sense. So another question: has China's SSBNs conducted deterrence patrol? It's I do not know, of course. China didn't declare that. But in China, there's some ambiguous news. For example, the PLA Daily reported that the PLA Navy submarine crew team has made outstanding contributions to the construction of a strategic naval force that matches the status of a great power. So they didn't say anything about, they didn't say what they did, but I guess this means probably this means China has conducted a long distance patrol. But should we call it a deterrence patrol, which means the submarine carry nuclear weapons or not? I do not know. I'm not sure. I believe it has conducted a patrol. So finally, I think it also takes time to learn how to run a SSBN fleet. China doesn't have that kind of experience. Our first generation SSBN has never conducted deterrent patrol. So there's a lot of things to learn, to solve, a lot of issues to solve. This is unlike the technology, the acquired in technology. This kind of command control and this kind of issues are solvable. I have no doubt that we could solve that as long as we continue to do that, to try to do that. We just need some time. So I think currently, I do not believe our SSBNs are operational. So return to my core argument, I think China does not have a survivable SSBN fleet, and I do not believe our SSBN is operational now. We are working on it, but not yet. I stop here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wu. I mean, that was interesting. Yeah. And kind of undermined my question, because if they are not operational, then maybe this is more a question for the future that I made about the anti-submarine warfare capabilities. Yeah, but very interesting. And yeah, last but again not least, I'd like to invite Hans Christensen to say something on Russian naval nuclear systems, which haven't yet been discussed. I mean, Poseidon was mentioned, but yeah, I'd like to look at the systems a little bit more broadly. So there's the Poseidon system that Russia unveiled a few years ago, and it's been called both a drone and a torpedo. And while the focus of our session is mostly on strategic dynamics involving long-range naval nuclear weapons, Russia also has dual-capable naval systems which could carry a non-strategic nuclear warhead. So, Hans, could you say a few words on the Russian naval nuclear capabilities and the related strategic stability considerations?
Certainly, thanks very much for the invitation here, and a great conversation, and an important one too. Certainly, because of where we are right now and where things are heading internationally. And so on the Russian side, of course, we've heard a lot of focus on the issue of escalation, using non-strategic nuclear weapons. Escalate. Some people have called it an escalate to de-escalate strategy. Others don't like that term. Some think it's new. Some other people think it's been there for many years. Whatever the situation is, Russian naval nuclear forces, like other aspects of the Russian nuclear arsenals, of course, are in heavy evolution, transitioning out of sort of cold Soviet era capabilities to more modern systems. We think that, I mean, there are no official numbers for the Russian non-strategic nuclear weapons. The U.S. estimate is sort of 1,000 to 2,000 non-strategic. We don't know exactly how that is broken down, but we estimate that out of Russia's mainly 4,400, 4,500 nuclear weapons in total, those 1,000 to 2,000 that we normally hear means up to 2,000. Some probably include something in the order of 800 to 900 warheads that are designated for non-strategic naval launchers. This is a significant commitment, of course, of nuclear forces to Russian naval systems, because Well, there's a bit of tradition there. Russia has had a lot of naval nuclear forces over the years, but it's also because naval nuclear capabilities are very much intended to compensate for sort of a sense of inferior conventional capabilities. In stark contrast, the US Navy left the tactical nuclear weapons business completely after the end of the Cold War. And even before the Cold War ended, started unilaterally reducing non-strategic systems, nuclear systems, because they were simply not needed anymore. Conventional forces could do the job. Not so in the Russian Navy. So they still have this very broad array of capabilities, warheads for dual capable systems, mostly, that can be used both conventional or nuclear, involve cruise missiles for land attack, anti-ship missions, anti-submarine rockets, torpedoes, depth bombs. It's a very broad range. And apart from sort of land attack cruise missiles that can attack land into sort of 1,000, 2,000 kilometers away, most of these naval nuclear systems are sort of battlefield nuclear weapons. They're intended to sink other ships and submarines. Sort of very Cold War type of battlefield mission, if you will. But that's, of course, because the Russian key mission is protection of its border areas. And they are designed to sink enemy ships and submarines that come to attack Russia. So the land attack weapons have, of course, some strategic stability implications, but only by virtue of the fact that they can sneak up on a coast and they can threaten cities or command centers, radar systems, bases inland, 1,000 to 2,000 kilometers, so to speak. So there is some effect there, but they can't. Naval tactical nuclear weapons, of course, cannot threaten the strategic nuclear capabilities of the Western powers. So one can debate endlessly, of course, what effect they would have, but it's not about undermining strategic stability directly. To the extent that strategic stability means the ability to have a safe retaliatory capability that no one can take out in a first strike. There are other kinds of strategic stability or tactical stability issues that are also relevant to talk about, of course. Now Russia is in a big modernization phase. So we are seeing replacement of old Soviet-era weapon system with fewer but more modern systems. And most focus right now these days is on systems like the Caliber land attack cruise missile, which in other versions also sort of has an anti-ship mission as well. So it exists both conventional and a nuclear. We heard about this Poseidon torpedo project, which is sort of, in my view, a completely crazy technology development experiment on the part of Russians that has very little, as far as I can see, direct strategic implications. It's not a game changer at any level, but we can get back to that discussion, of course. There's also an important decision about whether the new hypersonic missile, the Zircon system that is in development and close to deployment, operational deployment, may be nuclear. It's not clear to me from the sources I've seen, but who knows what comes out in the future, whatever. But if so, that would, of course, be important development, not strategic range-wise, but in tactical scenarios and regional scenarios because of its speed, basically. So this is basically shortening the window of decision time. So that can have implications for overreactions, needs to keep forces on higher readiness alert, et cetera, these types of considerations. So, of course, embedded in all of this are two major risk factors that you could think about. One, of course, has to do with misinterpretation and inadvertent escalation, a misinterpretation from the fact that most of these systems are dual capable. In a tense situation, something's coming flying at you, you have to make a split decision. How can you interpret that it is not a nuclear attack, but it's a conventional attack? etc. Can it lead to misunderstandings that way? How good, how relevant is it actually to use for Russia to use, for example, a nuclear land attack cruise missile, or reliable? We have seen in Ukraine that cruise missiles are being shut down to a significant extent. Does that mean that this will change the reliance on land attack nuclear cruise missiles in the future? We'll have to see what happens. And then, of course, there's also the issue of, in a crisis, in a war, if nuclear armed warships that are serving an important role are sunk by a conventional attack, is there a pathway to some form of escalation embedded in that type of scenario? So, in sum, we can say that, tactical non-strategic weapons can have a strategic effects if they're used to hunt down and eliminate strategic missile submarines. But it seems to me that the Russian ability to do so is very, very limited. I think the more important part of non-strategic forces is more of a potential pathway from conventional war to nuclear war escalation. And that has a whole bunch of other strategic stability implications, of course. So let me stop with these remarks, and hopefully they have triggered some questions. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Hans, and for everyone in the panel. I wonder if some of your presentations overlapped a bit, and you might have slightly different views on some issues. So if you'd like to respond to each other's presentations, feel free to do so. Otherwise, I will start going through the questions we have gotten from the audience. So if you, or at any point, if you want to.
Well, if I may, one
Sure.
quick question then. Professor Wu was a very interesting presentation that I very much agree with the main outline of. And so one element of that is to think about it, not just in terms of, is there a strategic effect in terms of the ability of the Chinese missile force in and of itself, what it can do, but also, of course, the dynamic. What happens in a major conflict if a strategic platform is hunted down and threatened? That's an important dynamic, potentially. I don't think it's here yet with China, because China's nuclear posture is overwhelmingly focused on land-based systems that are a lot more secure. But something to think about in the future, obviously.
Would you like to comment, Professor Wu?
This is definitely important, given the fact that China and the China-US relations is getting worse, and the possibility that both countries could get in a war in Taiwan or somewhere else, and so definitely a conventional war between China and the United States, two nuclear powers, definitely carries a risk of nuclear escalation, and so we need to consider that very carefully, and to identify the possible pathways from conventional to nuclear level. And you just mentioned that actually that is one of the pathways about the accidental inadvertent attacks on China's nuclear platforms. Actually, I'm not so concerned with that situation, because I prefer to believe let's say China's land-based missiles. I prefer to believe they are pretty survivable to conventional U.S. attacks, conventional U.S. inadvertent attacks. Conventional war, maybe it could happen that the United States inadvertently attacks Chinese nuclear platforms, but it is extremely unlikely that this kind of attacks could undermine China's nuclear retaliatory significantly. I do not believe that. So Chinese leaders will feel concerned, but definitely doesn't feel high pressure to react strongly. So I'm not so concerned with that. Actually, I'm more concerned with deliberate escalation like both sides get in a conventional war, and one side might be defeated conventionally. So the defeated, this side will have high pressure. You accept the lose, or you escalate. So that would be a more how to say, I'm more concerned with that kind of situation. But we definitely need to consider all of that. That is an important issue.
Yeah, many thanks for that. If there are no more comments from panelists to each other, then I could pick one question from the audience, from John Mason, who writes that if naval power is about projecting power, how can we stop that abstract projection of power turning inadvertently into a cause of unnecessary escalation? So, okay, we just heard that we also need to worry about intentional escalation, but if we go back to the risks of unintended escalation, and also what Hans said about the tactical or non-strategic systems. So maybe if I could, I mean, you feel free to answer that question from the audience, and if I could expand on it a little bit in terms of capabilities, because we already talked about, for example, sea-launched cruise missiles, which Russia already has, and there was a discussion in the United States also on whether they should have their nuclear-armed sea-launched cruise missiles. Plus, the United States has already deployed this W76-2 low-yield nuclear warhead in its strategic submarines. So I wonder if you see some risks of escalation or inadvertent escalation in those capabilities.
Sorry, was that a question to me, or was it?
Yeah, whoever feels like answering.
Oh,
if you'd like to go in first, then feel free.
Well, I already said something before, but so maybe a couple of the other speakers would like first.
Well, I can speak to that. I don't think that we're likely to see inadvertent escalation, because to most governments, the use of any nuclear weapon at all, in any circumstance, is crossing a major threshold. So the reason the United States gave up most naval nuclear weapons was the sense that they were unusable. During the Cold War, we got a lot out of nuclear cruise missiles because the Russians were compelled to track ships carrying them. And if we're not doing that, it really isn't worth the effort. The Russians have a lot of nuclear weapons. We always thought that if they were unwilling to use them, that tended to reduce their ability to shoot at anything, because the number of weapons they carried was much lower than they expected. It's very difficult to imagine the government owning nuclear weapons, taking their use lightly under any circumstances. That's why it's so scary when the Russians talk about this escalation to de-escalate stuff. NATO at one time had a doctrine like that. The idea was that if the Russians were overrunning Western Europe, then we would fire a couple of nuclear weapons to show that we were serious. And I was involved in studies of that sort of thing. The problem was that it wasn't clear that there was any limited use of nuclear weapons, which wouldn't end up worse than you started with. The usual line was that if NATO was going to lose anyway, they'd lose worse if they went nuclear. And that's the problem with any such thing. The question is, what target can you fire at that doesn't bring worse back in return? The answer is there isn't much of that sort. It just doesn't buy much. It sounds terrific when you buy the weapons, but they're not very usable.
If I could also quickly jump in on this question and kind of really take this idea of inadvertent escalation in the Southern Asian context, looking at China, India, and Pakistan. So when we are looking at the Indian Ocean region, increasingly it is being more contested and congested, and we're seeing the emergence and role of several different navies with the United Kingdom, United States, of course, the three different powers over there, China, India, and Pakistan, and also France. This idea that both India and Pakistan are moving from a state of recessed deterrence to one where it's actually operationalizing its second strike capabilities. India is trying to fuel its first nuclear submarine, whereas Pakistan is resorting to stopgap measures. We're seeing developments like where Pakistan is commingling assets, where they're putting nuclear tipped cruise missiles in submarines, diesel electric power submarines. This idea of entanglement and commingling of nuclear and non-nuclear assets is really injecting a lot of ambiguity in a space which is already contested and congested. And therefore, it really raises the chances of inadvertent escalation, but also leaves a little bit scope for deliberate escalation, given the fact that this idea, this lack of timely attribution of understanding the commingled platforms, the blurring of lines between conventional and strategic platforms, again, really opens that like black box of inadvertent escalation. And these developments really are happening at a time and space where countries do not engage in naval nuclear dialogue. China, India, and Pakistan do not communicate with each other focused on naval nuclear discussion. And therefore, to the question on the chat, it is extremely important to advance a global code of conduct when it comes to a lot of these newer emerging technologies, especially in the underwater domain, which has strategic stability implications, but also essentially just focused on strategic stability dialogue, focused on the nuclear naval competition amongst different navies.
Yeah, many thanks, Sylvia. Hans, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, very much. I very much agree with what Dr. Freeman said about no one would take the employment of nuclear weapons lightly. It's a major strategic decision at all levels, of course. One thing I find interesting, and when I normally hear people talk about inadvertent escalation, I get the sense that people sometimes think about sort of accidental, like something goes wrong technically or something like that. When I'm talking about it, I think more about sort of more unintentional, that you end up in a standoff where, because of the great differences in your capabilities at the conventional level, one side will decide to escalate in an attempt to stop that. I mean, all nuclear weapon states, certainly all major power nuclear weapon states, have de-escalation to some extent in their nuclear strategies. The idea is that they can turn up the heat in order to try to, compel the adversary to back down. But they vary significantly, not least because of the conventional capabilities. So, for example, the United States and the Western military powers are thought to have much greater conventional capabilities. Therefore, they don't have to rely as much on nuclear threats, on nuclear weapon systems. Whereas on the Russian side, which we certainly also are seeing now in Ukraine, their conventional capabilities are probably a lot less capable than we thought before. And so that can deepen a commitment to the role of nuclear weapons in the strategy. And so we may decide, if there's a war, that we go in conventionally, and that's the way we win it. And we do that because we don't want to resort to nuclear weapons use, and therefore we say that's a way to avoid that. But seen from the other side, that may not be very reassuring at all, because it means they lose and they have to resort to nuclear weapons to stop it. So there is that dynamic that is caused by these very, very insimilar nuclear weapons that are conventional forces that are on both sides. Thanks.
Yeah, many thanks for all of you who commented on that question. And then we have a question related to AUKUS. I mean, the deal whereby the UK and the United States agreed last year to deliver nuclear powered submarines to Australia. And there's been a lot of discussion on the non-proliferation challenges related to that. But yeah, the question was how it was actually addressed to Dr. Wu, how you think the AUKUS project, or whether it has changed the Chinese calculus in the region, and if I could add to that, from the perspective of the discussion today, would you be able to say to what extent is AUKUS related to anti-submarine warfare, and does China view it as a strategic threat, perhaps contributing to a damage limitation capability against China?
Yeah, of course. As I said, our SSBN fleet is not operational, so I'm more concerned with the impact of China-US conventional military balance rather than the strategic balance. So definitely, the deal, the submarine deal, could provide US side more available advanced attack submarines. That's a bad news for China. But for the future, if China has already put its SSBNs under developed deterrent patrol, I think that deal also could provide the US side more attack submarines. So US could trial every Chinese SSBNs or deterrent patrol. So definitely it has an impact. So by the way, I'm strongly against the deal. So I believe the deal undermines the non-proliferation regime and set up a very bad precedent. And unfortunately, United States believe competition with China is more important than non-proliferation regime. So I'm very sorry to say that, but that is a reality.
Many thanks, Dr. Wu. Anyone else like to comment on the AUKUS issue?
I can say something about AUKUS.
Sure.
I followed Australian submarine programs for many years, and given the distances they have to cover, the surprise was more that they didn't go to nuclear propulsion earlier. Many people who looked at Australian submarines described them as nuclear subs with the nuclear power plant removed. And if you're going to conduct any operations at the distances they envisage, nuclear is the natural way to go. It's not a matter of proliferation or non-proliferation or something like that. It's that if they're serious about the sheer distances in their region, this makes sense. Now, whether they can carry it off is another question, because they don't have a nuclear industry. But if you look at many countries with very large areas to cover, nuclear propulsion is a natural choice. I'm thinking of Canada in particular. They may not like the idea for ideological reasons, but I think they'll be driven in that direction.
Thank you so much. Just trying to read the questions while I'm.
Can I ask a comment on that question also?
Sure.
Well, I think there's one more element of it, of course, and we still have to see where that goes. This is about the Australian-US defense agreement here, UK defense agreement. That in the longer term, of course, once this system comes in, if they can manage it, there is also the issue of the long-range conventional capability, strike capabilities that will provide to the Australian submarine force. That will give it a different capability than it has in the past. I don't think it's something that's going to rock the boat in sort of the greater strategic stability balance in the region, but it will add to those capabilities in the future for sure. Yeah.
And just quickly to piggyback off Hans' point, one aspect of the AUKUS deal also includes like underwater drones. And I think that is important for us to note from the perspective that China has been deploying underwater drones in the South China Sea and has made repeated incursions using underwater drones in the territorial waters of Vietnam and also India. And this idea of advancing Australia's underwater drones capability is again an essential addendum to strengthen its submarine force, but also to provide a bit of posturing that forward missions and forward deployed missions by China using underwater drones is going to be countered in the Western Pacific. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sylvia and others. I have a question addressed to Dr. Friedman about the acoustic systems, which he mentioned work poorly, and that might be a problem. The person who asked this question was Jonas Olsson. So he asked if you could give examples of actual situations that have occurred.
No, I can't. We don't release information on submarine patrols and their results. During the Cold War, we certainly were able to trail Russian submarines, and we think that had significant effects on the end game in the Cold War. But we tend not to talk about that for good reasons.
Okay, then we'll move on to the, okay, there's a question on dual capable missile systems, although we discussed this a bit, I mean, and whether they can create ambiguity during a crisis. If you want to comment more on that, you're free to do that. Otherwise, I can pose an alternative question, which takes us a little bit away from this topic, namely cyber, which, okay, I think Sylvia mentioned cyber in her presentation, but we haven't, of course, we can't cover all the issues, but I wonder if you could comment briefly on the question on how safe nuclear submarines are from cyber attacks.
Well, it depends on how you arrange your communications. But the more interesting issue is what happens to unmanned vehicles under cyber attack, because you don't have human operators who can override whatever they're doing. And particularly if you're underwater, these vehicles are likely to be fairly independent. So if it's possible to penetrate their command systems, then very interesting things can happen. By the way, that's also a reason for not arming them. If you feel that your national existence may cease if you inadvertently blow someone up, you might care to have human beings at every level of your system. Remember that yes, you can certainly penetrate command and control systems. Whether you can predict the effect of the penetration is another interesting question. And the fear of penetration may inhibit people from developing large numbers of extremely capable drone systems. For example, do you really want to put offensive missiles on a drone of some sort? People have talked about it. It sounds terrific. You save manpower, which is very expensive. And then it occurs to you that if there's no one on board this thing, among other things, it may be seized, it may be misdirected. And the more that you see of cyber attack, the more nervous you get about such things. Do you really want to put very capable weapons on a device that you can't necessarily control? Huh? Where the use of them might have extremely serious consequences for your country? It's crazy. Now, there's a lot of crazy in the world, but that's very crazy.
Thank you, Dr. Freeman. Sylvia, did you want to jump on this?
No, I do agree with everything that Dr. Friedman said. A lot of scholars have also raised the possibility that when unmanned systems, command and control and communications are hacked, and we are increasingly seeing that it is possible with also jamming and spoofing, we really run the risk of a risky crisis behavior from adversaries. And a lot of scholars have shed a lot of light on this fact. And therefore, I think in terms of really looking at nuclear risk reduction efforts, something that the P5 countries have been talking about and really has come up in such a pronounced manner during this NPT review conference. One of the top policy recommendations for countries is to really come up with probably the P5 can come up with a joint statement which looks at negotiating or a common understanding of not attacking each other's NC3 system. During the review conference, the P3 statement really focused, which was sponsored by United States, UK, and France, talked about responsible use of artificial intelligence. And I'm really wondering, and also this is a question for all the panelists, what is the sense and what do you think if P5 countries can come up with a statement which essentially talks about non-attack on NC3 systems, especially to secure second strike capabilities?
Anyone want to respond to that?
Well, I'll throw myself in here and say that I think, statements of intent are great and can be confidence building and these things. But at the end of the day, of course, it depends on whether you will trust it. And the question is whether that's probably something you can hope will have an effect in good times. But cyber operations are even more opaque than nuclear operations. And so it's hard to imagine countries pursuing that, revealing anything about what they're doing or can do. I mean, we're talking about disruption of not only launcher systems, but we're talking about disruption and spoofing and what have you of command and control systems as well in the decision-making process. So this is a very opaque area that, at least I personally have a problem sort of identifying specific steps that can be taken, just because we frankly don't even know what the capabilities are. I mean, there are a lot of theories, of course, but we don't really know it in the public debate.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Unfortunately, there would be so many things to discuss, but we're already nearing the end of this short session. So at this point, I'd like all the panelists to give any final remarks if you'd like to make some before we end the meeting.
Well, if no one wants to say something, I'll just say a couple of words. So what we're seeing internationally, of course, is sort of a rapidly changing strategic environment, growing military and political competition here. And of course, arsenals are evolving, but I think the issue here is less about weapons than it is about the political climate that is going on. That's where the risk is. We're not going to get resolutions to weapons issues that the political will is not there. So I think the risk comes more from the dynamic than from specific weapons. the effect of Ukraine is still unclear. It may lead to more proliferation. It may not. It could certainly reinforce the role of existing nuclear weapons, and the way nuclear weapons states see nuclear weapons. But it could certainly also reinforce their determination to try to block proliferation of nuclear weapons to more countries. So there are all sorts of dynamics that come out of this. But again, I think more than weapon systems, and operations of them, I think it's of course the key issue here is more the strategic environment, the political dynamic that is happening.
I would like to very strongly second that. I believe that the Ukraine experience will lead to proliferation on a fairly large scale. That makes the world a lot less safe. And the reason is the sense that if you have nuclear weapons, people will not toy with attacking you. I should add that many years ago, I was in China, and someone from the foreign ministry said exactly that at the time the Russians were operating in Afghanistan, and he said, well, if the Afghans had the bomb, the Russians would never have walked in. And if I were Ukrainian right now, that's exactly what I would be saying. Now, whether they can get the weapons, whether they can overcome considerable barriers to proliferation, it's another story. I'm not sure the barriers really work terribly well. I would imagine that Iran is pretty close to a weapon now, despite a lot of efforts to block them. And I'm sure there have been covert programs elsewhere. Remember the South African program. So if you care about it enough, if you think it's national survival at stake, which I think many governments will say, then you're going to see a lot more nuclear states, possibly covert ones. And it's not going to be a happy experience. I don't like that as a result. I don't think that Dr. Christensen did either. But if you're serious about controlling these things, that's what you're looking at. That's why Ukraine is so terrifying, because the lesson is very simple. They gave up their weapons and the Russians walked in. Now, the Russians, what will happen if the Russian army starts to collapse? Will the Russians decide that they should keep raising the ante? That's terrifying. You're already seeing obscene amounts of attack, but it can get worse. Ouch.
Thank you, Dr. Friedman. I'm afraid we only have 2 minutes left. If you can make it in 30 seconds.
Yes, 30 seconds. The race for undersea capabilities, in all possibility, we are also going to see shifts in not only just operational postures, but doctrines, as we did see during learning the lessons from Cold War, and we are seeing this action-reaction cycle. But secondly, what I also wanted to emphasize is, as and how countries are expanding their underwater drones inventory, there's going to be a push for acquiring not only new bases, but also new places across the Indo-Pacific specifically. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvia. Professor Wu, would you have very quick comments? Sorry for not leaving enough time.
Yeah, just very quick. I'm optimistic with the future of China-US strategic stability. I mean the capability level, but I'm pessimistic with crisis management. I think both sides need more transparency, more dialogue to reduce the risk of nuclear war. Yeah.
Many thanks for those comments and others' comments, and thanks for the audience also for contributing and listening and for posting the questions. And sorry that I didn't have time to address all the questions. So we will need to end this SSC session in time, and I'd like to also remind you that this session will be followed by another session, which is titled Dual Capable Missiles and Non-Nuclear Missiles with Strategic Effect, and it starts at 2:45. So thanks a lot again, and wish you all a great day.